Copy. So on this first episode of DM Tips and Tricks, we're talking encounters and what specifically you as DMs can do to make them more interesting for your players. Roll the thing. Do that thing. Yeah. How's it going, everybody? Nick here with Roll Heroic, and in today's episode, like I said, we're talking encounters. I got a few tips and tricks on how to make them more interesting, spice them up, and yeah, let's just get right into it. Stretching. Remember, DMs need to stretch too. The first thing we're going to be talking about is objective transparency. So just what is objective transparency? Well, you want your players to know what it's going to take to complete this encounter. Is their mission to kill all the goblins? Is it to capture their leader? Maybe the goblins have an item that the players are interested in. This is information that needs, to be established while going into the encounter. Make sure you establish the intent of your enemies. If they're hell-bent on, killing all the PCs, make sure that's what they're focused on. If their mission is to, capture the bartender in the town and bring him back to their lair because he's somehow wronged their leader, whatever it is, make sure you're making that their focus. Establish the consequences of the encounter, if any. If they don't engage in the encounter, what's going to happen? What's the bad thing that's going to happen? Probably should be something, right? Maybe there won't be, though. Maybe the consequence is very minimal. I think the big takeaway here is to make sure the players know what's going on in the encounter, and also make sure that you play to the objective of the enemies. The next thing you want to do is establish the level of urgency. Does this encounter need to be completed with some degree of haste? If the encounter has consequences regarding how quickly the encounter is completed, let that be known to your players. If your encounter must be resolved as quickly as possible, make sure you remind your players regularly just what's at stake here. And if you've thought, this encounter doesn't need to really have a time limit, ask yourself, what really are the stakes here? Should there be some degree of urgency? Make it clear what's on the line if the players, start to dawdle their way through the encounter. Next thing I want to talk about is encounter environments, terrain, and lair actions. I don't think any encounter should take place in a boring, lifeless environment. Use the weather, the time of year, time of day, the size of the local population. Use those factors to dictate how you kind of run your encounter. Is the encounter happening in the open rural countryside, within the cramped halls of a dungeon, on a desolate mountaintop, or deep within an overgrown forest? Describe these locales as you enter them and periodically throughout your encounter. Maybe the party finds himself in a village and gets themselves into a bar fight. Take it to the streets. Maybe the streets have become muddied after a morning rainstorm. I've actually used that one before myself. It's a good way to use it. Use terrain features in your encounters. Maybe there's stone columns that are crumbling, waiting to get tipped over on the enemies. Maybe your party is chasing a group of orcs up a winding stone staircase. The staircase is crumbling and might just collapse under the weight of the cleric's armor. Use features such as quicksand, landslides, broken trees, or perhaps a thicket of thorny bushes to hamper the movements of your players. Or perhaps use the heat of the volcano the Red Dragon has claimed for its lair to exhaust the players. Chapter 5 in the DMG on page 99 has more information regarding environments. Oh yeah, lair actions. Use lair actions. They're not just for bosses, alright? If you're not familiar with layer actions, you're not going to find them in a DMG. You're actually going to find them on page 11 of the monster manual. So layer actions are a special type of action that usually happens on initiative count 20. This could be anything from, maybe a hot sandy wind comes rushing through the encounter area, pushing all the PCs and all the enemies, 10 feet in one direction, anything like that, really. Next, I want to talk about the enemies. Remember, play your enemies, your monsters and such, to their objectives. I want to remind you of that because that's pretty important. Don't be afraid to change what's in the monster manual, especially for you new DMs. If your party is made up of mostly ranged fighters, use melee fighters to tie them up while your ranged fighters pick them off from a distance. In one of my most recent sessions, I had a bunch of melee fighting orcs tie up my party while my ranged orcs picked them off at a distance, just wearing them down. I used that as an opportunity to get my boss creature into play. It was actually an Eden. In my opinion, I think that's a great way to use your monsters. I'd recommend, if you're not doing that, give it a try and see what it does for you. Mix up your monsters. Whoever said a stone giant wouldn't band together with a pack of gnolls, or a group of kobolds wouldn't ally themselves with a dirty old troll clearly doesn't understand the effectiveness of a disguise and high charisma. Alright, maybe those are crazy, but you get the point. Alright, let's talk about your boss monster. Alright, you need to make your boss a leader, right? Your boss didn't trick all of his subjects into following it just so he could die in close combat with the party. Give your boss legendary actions and use those actions to aid the creatures who are following it. I usually stick to 3 legendary actions, and those can be found on page 99 of the monster manual as well. If you want examples of legendary actions, just flip through the monster manual. Tons of the creatures have a list of them on their stat block, so that's what I always do. I just kind of pick what I like, alter what I don't like. Alright, here's a controversial one. If your party is made up of mostly spellcasters like mine is, let's limit their spell effectiveness. What does that mean? Does that mean we're punishing our players for picking spellcasting classes? I don't think it does. I think we can use this to challenge our spellcasting players. If you do or need to limit their spell effectiveness, how do we do this, right? I like 3 different ways. I like to give my boss monsters, or an important creature that's, crucial for the encounter to work, I like to give them magical resistance, if it makes sense. Immunity sometimes, if that makes sense. I also like to give them resistance to certain types of spells, perhaps cold or fire. It's a common one for my party. Also, you can use environmental hazards or areas such as magical dead zones, or areas that grant disadvantage to anyone using magic inside of it, or advantage to a save that is coming from a spell from within that area. Alright, let's talk about minions and spawners. You can that's a hard word. You can minionize your creatures and use them to overrun your party, or lure them into a trap. If you remember minions from 4E, God, do I love minions. 1 HP, they still hit the same, but you can just flood enemies at your party. Hordes of orcs, hordes of goblins, hordes of skeletons. Could you imagine your barbarian character just slicing through a sea of skeletons to get to the treasure that's sitting at the back of the chamber? That's why I like minions. So monster spawners. I love monster spawners. So what is that? Basically what I do is I take this spawner idea and make it a legendary action for one of my boss monsters. Let's say, for example, a pack of orcs, right? They're ran by an orc war chief, and he has a legendary action, monster spawner. That's what I read on there. And basically you'll get like 3 of them, and he can take one of those actions on his turn, right? And basically rolls a d6. On a 5 or a 6, he gets to recharge the enemies that the PCs have killed that round. And basically they respawn at the end of the initiative order. And basically it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get like a few of them on there, and then the next turn you don't get any. So basically I use it as a tension raiser, right? Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is spell-like abilities. Yeah, you know what those are. They're abilities that act like spells that ain't spells. One thing I've ran in the past was I had a bog witch that could use the teleport spell, but she had to follow a specific parameter. She had 3 magical fires in her lair, right? She could teleport on her turn to one of those 3 locations. from one of those 3 locations. And if one of those 3 locations was put out, via dispel magic or in some other way, then she was restricted to the 2 of them, right? Until they could finally pinpoint her into one corner and slay her. So another example is magic circle that's inscribed with runes on the floor. A dark wizard stands in there, and he's able to cast magic missile on almost an unlimited amount while he's in that circle. Sometimes they're overpowered, but I'll leave that to you. Make sure you're escalating tension within the encounter. You can do this by introducing a third party into the encounter. You can do this also by maybe a natural disaster starts to happen, right? You can do this by maybe one of the enemies takes somebody hostage. You want to think about those things, watch your players, wait for the right moment, and then use those elements within an encounter to make it more interesting. Last thing I want to talk about is initiative order. If your monsters rely on a specific legendary action from your boss monster, you want to break them up in more groups than you would usually do it on your initiative order. That way you get a higher chance that most of them will go below your boss creature on the initiative order. I don't know if the math really works out that way, but it seems to work out for me quite often. I also find it a lot easier to track my monsters when I break them up by weapon types, right? By damage types. So basically I'll keep all my melee fighters on one initiative card, and I'll keep all my ranged ones on the other, and then my specific monsters I'll do individually as well. That way I can track all their movement. Like all my melee fighters goes at once, all my ranged fighters go at another time, right? It seems to work for me, and I hope it works for you too. Alright, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the content or found it useful, please like, share, and subscribe. Hit the little bell icon to be notified when I put other videos up. But yeah, until next time, I've been Nick, and bye everybody.